Hello, my name is Katie Tress. I am a kindergarten teacher and the students I work with are between 5 and 6 years old. Today I will be using Google Drive to help me provide you with a brief overview of the data action model. In this model, professional educators form a team called a Professional Learning Community, or a PLC. Over the course of several weeks, the PLC meets to review student data, identify learning gaps, and develop and assess an intervention plan to target those gaps. Professionals share artifacts with one another in the form of student data and student and teacher work product. These artifacts are reviewed and critiqued by the PLC. Specific feedback is shared. This process allows for teachers to more effectively target learning gaps, provide interventions, and assess student learning. In my PLC, I worked with two professionals who were not at my school, so therefore our weekly data meetings took place online, primarily through shared Google Docs and Google Chat. Because one teacher in the PLC was a second grade teacher, our data action plan focused on two classrooms, hers and mine. But for the purposes of this presentation, I'm solely going to be focusing on the kindergarten classroom, my classroom. And we decided that our focus would be on reading. So our first step was to identify learning gaps among our students, and we took a look at reading data from both classrooms. This is my reading data. And this data was collected periodically. You'll see data from the fall on the far left of the data chart, and then we're going to be focusing on data from the winter right here in the middle, which was the last data collected before we started this data action model. So in kindergarten, we look at three benchmark items. One of them is letter ID, and we collect letter ID based on a total of 54 letters. That's 26 upper and 26 lowercase letters. And then additionally, we look at what we call Fancy A and Fancy G. So that makes for a total of 54. Word recognition. So students are given a list of 45 high-frequency words. They're expected to know 31 by the end of the kindergarten year. And we look at reading level. So at this point in the year, when this data was taken, which was January and quarter 2, students were expected to be reading a level 1 or a 2 to be considered on grade level. The SH that you'll see for 3 of my students here is shared reading, which means they are not yet independently reading a level 1 text, and they are considered below grade level if they're a shared reading in January. So for our data action plan, we looked at students who were reading below grade level, and in my class, as I said, that was 3 students at this time. As you'll notice further along in this presentation, my target group of students moves down to 2. One of these students in this group moved away. So I was left with 2 students reading below grade level. So our next step, using the Notice and Wonder protocol, we speculated about why these students were below grade level and concluded in both classrooms that it was phonics related. So this process drove our exploratory question, which you'll see here on our artifact tracking sheet. And after several revisions, our exploratory question became, how are we presently teaching phonics instruction to our struggling readers, and how can we improve instruction so students make more progress? So this was our original draft of our artifact tracking sheet, and the red text is the kindergarten classroom, my classroom. The blue text is the second grade classroom. So again, I'll be focusing on the red text. And we made several versions of this artifact tracking sheet to update it as we went along with this process. This is the revised version. And on the sheet, we looked at different artifacts that targeted phonics instruction, which was our driving exploratory question. And from those artifacts, we could perceive learning gaps or instructional gaps, their significance and their prominence. So we looked at shared reading lesson plans, a lot of those. Teacher calendar, we had some weather-related schedule changes, and that was an instructional gap because students weren't receiving their daily dose of targeted phonics instruction. But the thing we really honed in on here in the kindergarten classroom was letter identification data. I targeted that as my primary learning gap in my classroom. And of the 3 students at the time who were not yet reading a level 1 text, 2 of them knew less than 35 letters. And again, they were also reading below. They were the shared readers. So this was the primary learning gap that I wanted to focus on in my classroom. And I also concluded that of these students who didn't know very many letters, they probably also couldn't produce very many letter sounds. So overall, my PLC decided to focus on phonics. Again, in my classroom, that meant beginning letter sounds and beginning letter identification. And from here, we conducted a strategy search for strategies that would really target these learning gaps and instructional gaps and improve learning for our students. And that led to the creation of our action plan. It's loading here. And our goal with our action plan was to increase effective phonics instruction for students in order to have them be able to read higher levels of text, which was the ultimate goal. So here on this action plan, we listed our instructional tactics, the tactic method, the acting party, the frequency of how often these tasks would be done, and the completion date, as well as the verifying artifacts, so evidence that the instructional tactics had been implemented, and we rated their effectiveness. So we focused on 2 strategies. In both classrooms, students used Starfall, so Starfall ABC for kindergarten. And these were computer games that helped students practice letters and letter sounds. And so in my classroom, the specific students in my target group had Starfall computer activities built into their daily literacy center rotation. So what that looked like in the context of the reading block was for those students, they went to computer center as their first center every day during this time, and they spent about 15 to 20 minutes there practicing letters and letter sounds. Initially, I set it up and gave them preliminary instruction on how to access these games. Students eventually learned to do it independently, so this was something they could do by themselves as part of their literacy center rotation. And for both strategies, this one and the one I'll show you next, we decided that a month was a good time to reassess the effectiveness of our plan. So we started at the beginning of March and we gave it till the end of March to determine the effectiveness of our data action plan. For Starfall, we decided that letter sound assessment would be the most effective way to determine whether this intervention was working or not. So in the beginning of the implementation period, I gave letter sound assessments to the students in my target group. And these letter sound assessments were given again at the end of March to determine the effectiveness of these interventions. So just to take a quick look at Starfall, these are the letter games I was referring to. And students could click on a letter.
G.
They would be shown the letter and told the letter name. And then if they clicked on the sparkly arrows, they would hear the letter sound. It was also presented to them in the context of a word and then a sentence.
I am a girl.
So these were really effective games for independent practice during Literacy Center time. Back to the action plan. The next strategy that we used was using Reading A to Z leveled books for phonics instruction. And what this really focused on was target high frequency words with these students. So when students met in their guided reading groups, they would use these books that were printed and prepared by the teacher. And it was used daily as part of the reading block. Again, the end benchmark was March 30th. So just to take a look at some of these books, I used books in the high frequency word collection. This was a specific one that I used with students called Setting the Table, and it focused on the word the. So the was on every page, and there was a language pattern on every page. So the fork, the spoon, the knife. Students could latch onto the pattern and really learn that target word. So that was another good strategy we used in our action plan. The evaluation metric at the end were running records used to determine if increased phonics practice improved reading level, which was our goal. So after our implementation period, we looked at end of implementation period data to determine the effectiveness of our action plan. For my students, that was letter sound data. So preliminary data was taken in March. It was taken again in April to determine student growth and the effectiveness of our strategies. As you can see, this is student 1 in March. She came in knowing 16 letter sounds. In April, she increased her letter sound knowledge to 19 letter sounds. Student 2 made a 50% increase. He came in knowing 6 letter sounds, and in April he knew 12 letter sounds. And this data was based on a total of 26 letter sounds. So as you can see, for the letter sound data, students made significant progress due to our strategies. And in our final data meeting, we were asked to determine the effectiveness of our data action plan. Based on my letter sound data and then our overall data, students in my kindergarten classroom did meet the SMART goal of increasing a reading level. So below you'll see mine is the red text, and my students increased by 1 reading level, so they are now reading at a level 1 independently. We discussed that the next logical goal would be increased vocabulary knowledge for these students to keep improving their reading level, or I could focus on a new group of students and focus on improved high-frequency word knowledge. So through this process, which was an excellent process as a professional to go through, one area of strength that I identified was effectively implementing new strategies in the classroom. These strategies, the STAR-FALL strategies and the reading A to Z strategies, really proved effective for the learning of my students. One area of growth that I identified was conducting a more extensive strategy search. So looking for strategies beyond just the 2 that I used for this data action plan. And the protocol that I really liked to use was the Notice and Wonder protocol. I felt like in the beginning when we were first looking at data, that really helped us funnel our search into an effective exploratory question, and that drove the rest of this process. Again, I think this was a really effective process for me as a professional, and it definitely improved the learning of my students.